Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer back with another live stream episode of the Social Change Career Podcast. It's actually the last episode of 2024 in season 13. We're going to be talking about strategic change making insights on careers and impact in atrocity, prevention, and advocacy with Mike Brand. For people who may not have joined us for a previous live stream, just generally goes about 55 minutes. We really enjoy hearing from people if you're engaged on LinkedIn or YouTube. So at any point, feel free to put in the chat a couple of bullet points about your work and also let us know where you're watching from and particularly your questions. This will be converted to one of 170 episodes of the podcast, not this Friday, the following Friday. And then 3 quick requests. Please follow Mike on LinkedIn and all the great organizations he talks about. Those will be in the show notes once the podcast episode is live. Please, the number one thing you can do for any podcaster, if you like podcasts, I'm addicted to them, is take 10 seconds or 30 seconds to share and rate it. So you can, if you like this episode and previous episodes, please share and rate it. And you can filter and search on PCDN Global or any major podcasting platform. And then please consider subscribing to our free weekly newsletter. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. I assume, Mike, you're in DC today or the DC area. Yep. So I will summarize Mike's bio and then we'll jump in. So Mike is a human rights, atrocity prevention, and peace building professional with deep experience in policy, advocacy, organization, education. Throughout his career, he has worked for various and leading non-governmental organizations in the US, Rwanda, and South Sudan, and has done field work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. He supports civil society organizations and diaspora networks in strategic planning, program development, and achieving their advocacy and organizing objectives. He's published widely in all kinds of peer-reviewed publications and media outlets, and has been quoted in many different international news outlets on conflict and advocacy themes. He's also an adjunct professor of mass atrocities prevention and human rights at Georgetown University and the University of Connecticut. He holds a master's in international peace and conflict resolution from American University, and also a political science with a minor in human rights from the University of Connecticut. So Mike, thank you so much for taking time, and your background is really inspiring. And so just to start off with, if you think back to your teenage years, have you always been interested around challenging issues related to global affairs? Did you aspire to work around policy, or were you envisioning being a doctor, a lawyer, a business person? So when did you first become aware of the incredible challenges that the world faces and that engaging in policy advocacy might be a place you'd want to work?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and great question. Yeah, I mean, when I went to college at the University of Connecticut, my plan was to go to medical school, and my goal was, to go abroad and do Doctors Without Borders and really get into really rough zones, as a medical provider. And while I was in undergrad, I was studying, history because, I was interested in history, but I was also taking all the pre-med courses. And in one of those classes, I learned about the 1994 genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, and that kind of blew my mind. My family background, my grandfather was, narrowly escaped the Holocaust, and I've learned about genocide, most of my life, but never really learned about other places, just really the Holocaust. And so when I learned that, Rwanda happened during my lifetime and, I didn't know about it, none of my friends knew about it, I called my family up. I was like, hey, do you remember learning about this? Do you remember hearing this in the news? Nobody really did. And we all remembered, the O.J. Simpson, car chase. And we remembered, going and watching Lion King, but, all which happened in 1994. Nobody remembered Rwanda. And so that, really kind of blew my mind. That put me on a course that, shifted focus. I, took this minor at UConn, which was great in human rights. Now they have a major and they have a master's program as well. And really just started to get more interested in specifically, genocide and mass atrocities, war crimes and crimes against humanity, because I felt like many of the other human rights abuses that happen around the world, they're sometimes complex. There's sometimes, big systems at play. But mass atrocities are really people-centered. One group of people is targeting another group of people specifically because of who they are. And during that time, just by happenstance, there was also, the ongoing genocide in Darfur. There was the violence, and with the northern Uganda with the LRA, Lord's Resistance Army. So I just started getting more involved with advocacy from these different organizations. Started coming to DC pretty regularly for conferences, for Hill days, lobby days, things like that. And really, that was just what set me up on that course to get more involved in this world of atrocity prevention.
Thank you so much. And people may not know University of Connecticut is famous for lots of things, including one of the top women's basketball teams in the country, but also human rights. It's a very strong institution for human rights. And how did you go from undergrad? Did you pursue a master's shortly afterwards, or did you do policy, or did you work on Capitol Hill for a while?
Yeah, no, great question. So I took some time, I was doing some work, right out of college, I'm from New York originally, so I was working in the city. And after about a year of, working, a mix between advocacy and grant making, I decided to just pick up and go to Rwanda. I did some research, found an organization to volunteer with, and just went. I figured, now's the time. When else will I be able to just, pick up and go when I don't have a lot of responsibilities? It was a great experience. I was there for 3 months, and I definitely encourage anybody who's interested in learning more about the countries that they've done research on or programming on is to go there, because you learn so much more by being in country, meeting people, learning from them, seeing some challenges, etc. So I did that, came back, did some other work, and then actually went back to Rwanda for a year, and volunteered again, through a fellowship program, where I was living at a youth village called the Atrocity Youth Village. I taught at the school, did some other work, but also they, kept those relationships that I had built with people, for my first trip. And then when I came back, I decided to, go to grad school eventually, and came to DC. I wanted to be in DC, and been here for a few years now. It took some time between DC, went abroad again. Moved to California for a job. So it's a bit of a mix. But yeah, your question on Capitol Hill. If I could have done everything over again, I think I would have tried to come to DC earlier and worked on the Hill or done something else in that vein, because it's a lot easier when you're younger. The Hill doesn't pay all that well. It's getting a little bit better, but it's some really good learning experience for people that are early entry careers, and then you can turn that into more work in DC. And there's a lot that you can learn from being directly in Congress, as opposed to just being on the outside.
So can you talk? I mean, I had a different path than you, but also was very fortunate to spend multiple years abroad, both study abroad and on fellowships. And so can you talk a little bit, going back to that post-college experience, or when you did the 3 months in Rwanda and then the year of fellowship? For people, let's say, who are younger and have the either financial ability or can land a fellowship or just can find a place that'll pay their room and board, what is your advice for trying to find a placement that is both meaningful for the person who is seeking to volunteer and the host organization? And how do you vet both ways to make sure? It's pretty risky just to, I mean, it can be a great experience, and I know lots of people it's been wonderful for, and going overseas has been one of the most incredible things in my life. I mean, I've been living out of the US for maybe a third of my life, but also there's lots of bad examples where either an organization promises something and is not a good match, or the volunteer has a mental breakdown, or so any advice in general, and also as someone probably who's hosted a lot of interns and elsewhere, just like your thoughts on how to find a potential match that could help you upskill.
Yeah, so I'll tell you. I mean, the first trip that I went, for those 3 months, like I said, it was a year out of college. Convinced my girlfriend at the time to go with me as well. But literally, I just was searching like organizations. I decided I wanted to go to Rwanda because I had done so much research on the genocide. I felt like I wanted to go there and see, how the country was developing. But I found an organization online, engaged some dialogue with them via email, and then just started searching, trying to find anybody else who had been talking about this organization. And lo and behold, I found a blog from a young woman who had volunteered there. She was Canadian. Shot her an email in the dark, didn't know her at all, just sent her a message. She responded and said that she was actually still living in Rwanda and was, now teaching at a school, and, she had an extra bedroom, and she'd be happy to rent it out to us. So, I mean, it was literally just like that kind of step process. And the vetting process really for me was trying to see if there was anything out there from people saying bad things about the organization, or once I found this woman, to ask her directly, hey, you did this, you volunteer with this organization, like, do you recommend it? Are they doing good work? Like, what's the situation like? And so you're not going to always have that. I mean, I think the best thing you can do is try to talk to the people that are involved, or talk to people who have gone through that fellowship experience. Try to find somebody on LinkedIn or something else if you can. And really, a lot of the time with any of these kinds of programs, you get out of it what you put into it also, right? There's obviously a lot of at play based on what the organization is doing, if they're a strong organization, if they're doing good work, all that kind of stuff. But you can also build a lot more. And I learned this, even from folks who I met who were in the Peace Corps. Some of them did their assignment and like sat in their room the rest of the day, or like did their assignment and then tried to go travel. Others were like building connections in the community and really trying to build a relationship with the people they were working with, and building new programs in the school and all this stuff. And you have to have a little bit of like an entrepreneurial attitude. I mean, when I went to Rwanda for the year at ASYV, I distinctly remember, each one of us, there was, I think, 10 of us in that year. Each one of us had like a specific track that we were, supporting in, arts or music or whatever. And I was supporting the IT infrastructure. I'm good with computers. It's like a side thing that I like doing. But I specifically asked, like, hey, like, are we, do you need me to teach in the school? Like, I know you have an IT program. And they're like, oh, no, we have, an IT teacher. He's great. It's all good. And then a week before school started, they realized that they needed more help. And so all of a sudden now I had a full class of 125 students that I needed to teach. So it was like a big pivot, and I just, went into it, full on, and, made the best of it. But I think, for some folks, if you're too maybe type A and like too regimented, like that might not be the thing for you. You may not be able to roll with the punches. So just you got to know yourself a little bit, and then also be willing to experience what comes.
Yes, I think that's really good advice. And there's a lot more platforms now that you can potentially vet organizations. And there's also, I mean, Georgetown, where was 10 years full time, we helped send students all over the world to work both with partners and they found themselves. And a lot were great matches, but sometimes it sounds great and people show up and the organization's corrupt, or the volunteer can't do the work. It goes both ways. I don't want to just say it's one way. And there's a lot of challenges. There's also a lot of challenges in the financing, who gets to volunteer, but that's a whole nother question.
Definitely. I mean, I was very fortunate, that I saved up some money living at home, for that first trip. And then the second trip it was financed, right? Like I didn't make any money really, but like the trip, was covered, like the room and board, everything like that. And so, yeah, you got to also determine what is good for you. But yeah, there are definitely more opportunities, and I would say, you could always start small, right? If there are students that are listening, go on an alternative break, go on a semester abroad, like do what you can, maybe a little bit of a less of a financial burden, and then, see if there's scholarships available, any of those kinds of things. And then there's also bigger things, right? Like the Boren Fellowship, where you go and learn a language abroad, like things that are part of the U.S. government that you can do. So it really depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah, I was fortunate. I did junior abroad right after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, maybe 8 months afterwards. And that, went to Hungary, literally changed my life. So I ended up spending 3 years there. And I think anyone who can find and secure the opportunities, whether it's through formal study, fellowships, professional work, to be able to spend in-depth time in other places, like it just, I think, one, it creates such an awareness of yourself as a human being, and, and how other cultures differ or not. And also just career-wise, it just is such a career boost in terms of understanding other cultures, languages, policies. So I want to go back when you first went to Rwanda the second time. What was it like? I mean, the genocide was 94. Were you there 6 years afterwards, 5 years? And what was it like as an outsider to be in a place where, I mean, there's mass atrocities, unfortunately, in many places in the world. Lots of people say never, never again. I mean, that saying is almost pointless anymore because it's again and again.
Yep.
But what was it like? I went to Yugoslavia, when the war was happening there. And that was, I wasn't in the fighting regions, but did work with refugees and all sorts of different things. And that was, I would say, the first conflict that I saw where I knew people from all different parts and just saw this devastating impact. And so what was it like to go somewhere where this level of violence had happened and there was some kind of transitional justice process?
Yeah. So I was there. 2008 was the first trip that I took, and went back at the end of 2009 for the full year of 2010. So both trips are different. I mean, the first trip, it was my first trip, anywhere in Africa. My first trip, really big abroad, by myself. I mean, obviously I was with my girlfriend, but like not, like a family trip or something like that. So it was a big learning curve. Didn't speak the language. A lot of people at that time didn't speak as much English as they do today. So getting around sometimes was difficult, things like that. But it was also a big, somewhat like cognitive dissonance between having learned in this like bubble of just the genocide and not thinking really about the people who are living today and like what does that look like. And some of the best people, just lovely, honest, super supportive folks that I met, people that I met that I still friends with today, so many years later. So that was a little, of a, interesting, dynamic. I think, thinking about what was not being said was also, I've been to Rwanda now multiple times since then. And, every year things get a little bit, worse and a little bit better in certain ways. And I think, it's a very closed society in certain ways. There's not, freedom to, criticize the government and challenges around that. And so you see some of these things that you learn for the first time. I mean, when I was there in 2010, there was a lot of things going on. There was an election. There was, some shady things that were happening with, presidential candidates that were being arrested, or, the vice presidential candidate from another party ended up being killed. There were grenade attacks. Like, so there was a lot of things that were happening different than my first time there. And it was a different experience because of the fact that, it was an election year, and, there was just a lot of things that were going on. But it's interesting over the years. I've asked questions of folks, and especially when people that I know get out of the country and they see other things from other parts of the world. The dynamic changes a little bit, the thoughts change a little bit, and I think Rwanda is a really interesting case study for when you think about a post-conflict, post-genocide society where there hasn't been a lot of violence in Rwanda, since 1994, 30 plus years later. But you look just right next door in Eastern DRC, and there's been a lot of violence, right? And so if Rwanda's map was just a little bit wider, if the borders were drawn a little differently, what would the story of Rwanda be today? And similarly, the reverse of that, if, with so many conflicts today, as you said, like, never again is meaningless, so many atrocities today, a lot of them are not ending as swiftly as Rwanda did, right? Like, it was a 3 month, crisis, a million people were killed. It was horrific, millions of displaced. But then it pretty much ended, at least within the borders of Rwanda. Whereas many other crises, there's multiple attempts at negotiations of power sharing agreements, all these kinds of things, which, what does, if that was the take for Rwanda, if that was the plan, if the peacekeeping forces, actually stepped up, what would that have looked like, 20 years, 30 years later?
And can you talk a little bit about how did you mentioned a little bit post undergraduate that you did some work in New York City on funding and advocacy. Was that related to domestic issues, any particular policy? And when did you first, let's say, have a paid job or
Yeah.
fellowship where, and just explain like what in the world, for people who may not be familiar, what does it mean to work in advocacy? Is it like communications? Is it strategy? Is it campaigns? And who are you trying to influence on behalf of whom?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question a little bit separated out, because like to answer what advocacy is a little bit more than what I was doing, right out of college. But my first job started as an internship and turned into a consultancy where I was working with the advocacy department on mainly then the presidential election. We had a fellowship. We had people that were sending out into the country to do awareness raising about some key issues, pretty wide ranging issues. Some of them we focused on the genocide in Darfur. Some of them were focused on wider, just like inequality issues, healthcare issues, things like that. And then a little bit more work, specifically on the situation in Darfur. When that was wrapping up, I was fortunate that they wanted to keep me on, but they didn't have a full-time position for me, so they kept me on as a consultant, but in the grant making department. And so I was doing, a wide range of work, with the grants department, helping, support the programming that was being done around the world. And so, that was like reviewing letters of inquiry and, managing the grant portfolios, moving money, those kinds of like, basic things. We got to learn, a tremendous amount. To answer, your question on the advocacy side, it's a wide range of things, and it's a very collaborative, type of work. You need the communication side, you need the organizing side, you need the people that are going to just go and march on the Hill. You need the grassroots folks that you're going to work with to try to get, in district meetings or bring them to DC. And so it really depends on what kind of advocacy you're doing. There are some, individuals and organizations that, don't have the resources to have somebody in DC to be, knocking on all the doors of Congress, going to meetings with the National Security Council or the State Department, et cetera. And so, one of the fortunate things after COVID is a lot of meetings now are virtual anyway. People are working remotely, people are working from home. So, some of that can get done virtually, just via email, via social media, et cetera. But like a 360, strong advocacy program, has components of somebody that's, building a strategy, building, what's our end goal, how do we achieve it, who are we trying to influence, who are they going to listen to? Because even though my job is advocacy, I might not be the best advocate for that particular individual. Trying to get, those folks involved, and then, bringing different people in, bringing expertise, bringing, research if you can, stories from, the countries that you're working in, and then trying to change, the situation. Sometimes it's a long, haul. And if it's, a bill that you're trying to pass, it might take multiple years. If it's a short-term thing on, a bill or resolution, you may have a fixed deadline. There's some efforts, right now that are going on that, as Congress is winding down, there's some things that, people are trying to push over the finish line, or at the very least get a bunch of co-sponsors so that when the bill gets reintroduced in the new Congress, we can kind of hit the ground running. But yeah, it takes a lot, and it really, often is a collaborative effort. There's a lot of working groups and coalitions, and one-off kind of working groups on specific things where people will either get in a room or on Zoom and, really try to figure out how do we move the needle going forward.
And can you talk a little bit, let's say, from your early, more, let's say, when you came back from Rwanda, whether it was pre-MA or post-MA, like what is a concrete example of something that was achievable? Because there's really large term goals like let's end poverty or get clean water for everybody, and they're incredibly worthwhile. But the idea that we're going to magically do that, so like what was something, one of the first campaigns where you played a part in that was definable, measurable, and like some, you could say within a certain period of time, you and the partners in the coalition, like some change happened, and
Yeah,
like describe how that works.
for sure. I can give you a couple examples. Early on, when I was still in college, and then I think like right after, like I said, I was doing a lot of work on Darfur and also, the violence in, northern Uganda. And so, we, through coalition work, we got, pretty strong support, from Congress on a bipartisan basis to provide, further funding and support for, the violence that was going on in northern LRA, which, included direct funding for assistance and humanitarian issues, but also funding to help track down folks within the LRA and move them out of, some of these areas. And similarly on Darfur, this was at a time when, for folks that don't remember, we were in two different wars. There's a lot of going on in the world, but getting the Bush administration and getting, Congress to support, more funding, support generally the investigations that were going on by the ICC, to not really kind of fight that effort too much. Those were kind of tangible, specific things. Obviously, didn't change the outcome of the war, unfortunately. But deploying the UN peacekeeping force, as an example, UNIMID, was a big accomplishment. Later on, bigger swings, things like the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act. This was something that took multiple years, had different strategies for how to actually try to get that passed. And it actually finally did pass, during the last Trump administration and was signed into law, by President Trump. And so, that law getting into, actually being signed into law was great for a lot of reasons. Put it on paper that, it's U.S. policy to, want to prevent mass atrocities from happening, and say that, we need a strategy for this, and everything in the strategy was developed. But again, where the rubber meets the road, when you think about how many atrocities situations are happening around the world today, has U.S. policy changed at all, really, since that bill was passed into law? Which is probably a question for another podcast.
So we have people watching from around the world. So please, again, feel free to put your comments, your questions. Let us know where you're watching from. So two questions here. Um, so when you think about, I mean, how have you seen advocacy change? Let's say over the 15 years or so you've been engaged in policy and advocacy. Is it the same set of skills and strategies that in 2009 or 2008 or saved our four type work, or is it more sophisticated because of all the data metrics and online media and just communication? So that's one thing. And the second thing is, where do you see advocacy going in terms of the skills and the next generation?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely changed over the years. I think, with new technology, like when I first was getting started in advocacy in college, like social media was just starting to become a thing, right? And so there was some organizing that we did on campus on Facebook, as an example, but it didn't have the reach that social media does today. So being able to organize, across the world, with trends or with, certain things where you could, really just speak into your phone, and then all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people can watch that. This is not something that we had really at the same level back then. I think, there's other technologies like, the very simple, click to email your member of Congress, those kinds of things that are very useful, at least to get, low level, like first, round, people getting involved in advocacy for the first time. But, I think there's some downsides too, because when there's so much, we're like almost oversaturated. And so sometimes, because of that, messages can get, mixed up, messages can get lost, people can be, spreading information online that might not really be true. And it's very difficult these days to know, what's a reliable source and what's not. And so I think that can also be, a challenge with some of the new technology that we have. Where things are going, I don't know. I think it's, at least in this country, in the United States, one of the biggest challenges that we need to figure out how to deal with is money in politics. And, there's really just very big, private interests, PACs, et cetera, that have way more money than NGOs ever will, or grassroots organizations ever will. And so when those organizations tend to be on opposite sides of an issue, the power that those, corporate interest PACs, et cetera, have to spend, it's just, wildly, out of touch with what NGOs can do. I remember when I was younger, there was a campaigner who would say, all the time, like, we were lucky in the, anti-genocide community because there's not really a pro-genocide lobby like there is a pro-cigarette lobby or a pro-oil lobby. But that's not true these days, right? There are pro, atrocity lobbies, and it might not be articulated that way, but you have, violent dictators from around the world that hire lobby firms to advocate on their behalf, to ensure that they don't get sanctions, to ensure that their narrative is what's being spun, and try to blame others. And so this is an ongoing problem that we have to confront, and a lot of it happens behind the scenes, and you won't really hear about it until there's some kind of a scandal. But I remember, years ago, South Sudan, as an example, the U.S. government was trying to fund a hybrid court and spending all this money to try to ensure that there was accountability and transitional justice and all this stuff. And, that it came out that South Sudan the government was trying to hire a lobby firm for multiple millions of dollars specifically to advocate against the hybrid court, which they had already agreed to. That's just one example, but there's obviously, countless others.
I mean, to make a really good point, and obviously a lot of regimes that want to, I mean, obviously a couple of Congress people have been arrested recently, and this happens periodically for receiving favors or to put certain, reduce human rights demands on certain governments, or even, certain mayoral, not candidates, but mayors, for receiving bribes or things. So what is the difference, you would say? Because there is a huge PR industry, and we need, I mean, Coca-Cola is a huge company, spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year to get people to buy their products.
Yep.
But Greenpeace is doing PR campaigning, and so what is it the same set of skills if you're doing public relations or advocacy or communications, or and they're just applied in different means, or like is there some kind of technical definition?
This is a great question. There's a really good video, and I'm going to butcher it, so I don't really have it. But they were trying to explain the difference between communications, PR, and marketing, and how marketing kind of is this all-encompassing thing, right? It's not just putting out an ad, it's not just getting a really good logo, it's not just getting a story placed. It's the whole gamut of getting the story plays, getting an influencer to talk about it, getting the product featured in a TV or a commercial, whatever the case may be, and having like a viral moment, like all of that coming together. And I think that's really, when you think about advocacy, that's more in that realm, right? It's all those pieces together. So there's the people that are going to sit there and have the meetings regularly with staffers on the Hill, and have those conversations with the folks at the State Department and at the White House, et cetera. There's the people that you need to be communicating with, your email list and getting them involved and getting the grassroots component going. There's the social media campaigning that you need to do, which the messaging on social media is usually very different than the email messaging that you have. It's knowing the back end, like you said, the technology to know who's your audience, what's your list, like A/B testing your messages. What are they opening? How do we actually get to them? Maybe sometimes having different messages for different audiences. And then, sometimes it's the guerrilla activism, as well. It's, like you mentioned, Greenpeace, like banner dropping, or, ads that you take out on bus benches, things like that that are a little bit, different. And then sometimes, it's like the protests and, die-ins, or, staging things, getting arrested in front of, an embassy, like, all those things coming together, can incorporate, to this bigger umbrella of, advocacy. So I don't think it's just one thing. That's not to say that you always have to do all of the things that I just mentioned. But I think, oftentimes, if you have the time, if you have the money, if you have the capability, doing a wider range of activities can get you better results. And, frankly, sometimes no matter how great your campaigning is, no matter how great your messaging is, no matter how right you think you are, you may just never change the minds of certain individuals based on other issues. And that's just, the unfortunate reality.
And can you talk a little bit? You've touched on it some. So for people who are, because we need all different aspects of social change. We had on the co-founder of Climate Base for our podcast we did yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the message is every job could have every role could have a climate function, because we
Sure.
need finance people and graphic design and communications and web builders and IT and software and solar engineers. So is there a
Definitely.
similar kind of message if you're thinking about trying to influence on behalf of movements or just policy? Like, and of those roles or functions, are there certain ones that you see like everybody wants to be on the front line doing X, but what is really needed a lot more these skills, and there's not as
Yeah.
many people applying for those jobs?
No, I think you're definitely right. I mean, any organization, especially bigger organizations, need all those people, right? Smaller organizations, you tend to wear many hats, and so you may be doing a little bit of everything. But if you get specialized in certain things, right, like development people that can be a really good fundraiser, whether that's applying for grants, whether that's going and meeting with wealthy donors in salons, or doing direct fundraising via email campaigns, things like that. That's a skill set. Like, I've done a lot of fundraising in my career, but it's not something that I personally love doing. It's not something that I think that I'm excellent at. But there are some people who are just very good at taking what the core message is that you need, what kind of funding you're looking for, and turning it into a really good, campaign pitch, or, turning it into a really good grant application. And so that's always a useful skill in the NGO space, because, NGOs rely on outside funding, right? They don't have means to generate their own funds usually. I think, any kind of communication, folks are always useful in a variety of different ways, and you can take those skills and use them in different, places. Some people are better at people to people interactions, right? And so campaign organizers where you're really doing the work of calling people up, speaking to them on the phone, motivating them to take action, doing that kind of journey, with them, encouraging them to take a small step and then build on that step and all that kind of stuff. That sometimes is very different than somebody who's really good at social media, right? Like they might just want to not talk to 100 different people a day. Like they might want to just be on the computer, be able to churn out really great graphics and really great, short, pithy messages. And so you have to know what you're interested in. And sometimes, you got a little bit of trial and error to, see both what you like and what you don't like. And then there's folks that are just very good at getting into the weeds of, what's possible within how either, the US system, the UK system, like wherever you are, works. And so, there's, room for just people that are very analytical and like to, get into the weeds of the law. There's, lawyers that can be involved. So it really runs the gamut. And I think there's a space for, anybody really with any skill set that they, if they're interested in a topic, and want to get more involved. And I think there's also people who just love the thing that they do, right? So personally, like as you mentioned, I focus on mass atrocities and I focus on human rights. Like that's my, wheelhouse, mainly mass atrocities, across sub-Saharan Africa and also a little bit into North Africa and the Middle East. So like that's the area that I like to focus on. There are other people who just like advocacy or just like communications. And so, they may not care as much what they're advocating for, what the issue is, what the organization is, as long as it's something, good. And so, I have, friends who I know have bounced between, doing, the more peace building work to then going and doing climate work to then going and working for, cancer foundation, right? And it's the work that they're interested in, less so the topic.
And can you talk a little bit as someone from the US who often does work? I mean, obviously you're trying to both influence US policymakers and donors and others in coalitions, but a lot of the challenges you're partnering with are people in sub-Saharan Africa. So what is the appropriate role for organizations that are, let's say, are not from that region, or most of their staff isn't, and just kind of how does someone from the US ally and work effectively with partners? And how are you also advocating, with national governments or the AU or other UN, multilaterals? Like, how do you decide what's the right set of organizations as a group? As you say, this is the world and these are the institutions that people have influence, and we're going to divide it up and among this group and partners, and someone else go after the AU, and we're going to do this, and just those kind of things.
Yeah, well, I think, I forget who said it originally, but, this idea of, no decisions about me without me. So I think it's really important, when you're in the advocacy world, or the programmatic world, with your grant making or supporting programs, to involve the local people that are going to be most impacted by the policy decisions. I think that's a really important thing that I've, strived to do throughout my career, and been fortunate to be in multiple positions, either directly running, both grant making programs and advocacy programs, or having, direct partners, in country or, from the diaspora. I think, the caveat to that is, there's a really frustrating thing that often happens, especially within the US government, but also sometimes in the international sphere, where, in a crisis situation, they'll say something like, well, what's civil society's opinion on this? And in no situation anywhere in the world is civil society going to be 100% united on any given topic, right? Imagine in this country, if you tried to say like, oh, what is the civil society opinion on whatever the topic may be, foreign aid funding, abortion, domestic issues, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't happen. And so it's a little pedantic to some degree to say to civil society from other countries, like, hey, come to us with one, position. So I say that to say, you can do as much as you can to get, locally informed information and, trusted sources and everything else. But you have to also recognize that not everybody's going to agree with whatever position you end up taking. But I think it always should be informed by, the people that are there. I think, as far as your question about, dividing up, like who's doing what, the AU engagement, the New York engagement, DC engagement, London engagement, Brussels, the EU, et cetera. It really depends, like, on the strengths of the different organizations, what their reach is, do they have offices in different parts of the world? And sometimes it does, end up being information sharing and dividing up, right? So sometimes We were talking right before we started. I was just in London, on vacation, but while I was there, I, was able to meet with some, friends and colleagues and partners, some of whom I've only met, virtually, because I'm not in London all that often, unfortunately. But sometimes it is that information sharing, like, hey, like this is what we're hearing, DC side, or this is what we're hearing in New York. What's it like? In Whitehall, what's it like? In 10 Downing Street, like what's happening on the other side of the pond, and then figuring out who has the best connections, if there are people that have offices on the continent nearby in East Africa, or even in Ethiopia and Addis. Obviously, they're better placed to go and have a meeting directly with the AU, than somebody that's here. Although you can do virtual meetings for sure. But so sometimes there is that, collaboration and trust, between different organizations to share information, to join, in the coalition letters, or, sign-on letters and things like that, shared advocacy, messages. And unfortunately, there is still some of that competition, right? Because there's a finite amount of resources, even though there's plenty of money to go around the world. Everybody's competing for different, foundation support or grassroots support or whatever the case may be. So there is a balancing act there of, trying to work together, and also in some cases, not that I think it's really a competition, but sometimes you are unfortunately competing for resources.
Can you talk a little bit about, obviously, Colombia just hosted the 16th biodiversity COP talks,
Mm-hmm.
and Azerbaijan just hosted the other one. Saudi's got some desertification talks. And a lot of people are in the plastic talks that just took place in South Korea. But a lot of those people have been saying, and I have friends who went to Colombia, and the one in Cali, and also Azerbaijan. And there's been a lot of reports saying, like, there's lots of civil society and multilaterals, but the number of representatives from oil companies and plastic companies is just dwarfing.
Yeah.
Maybe not in number, but so when you talked about kind of the forces that are advocating maybe for repressive interests, and the forces that are advocating for more rights-based approaches and inclusion and humanity, like, is there a fundamental imbalance, or just depends on that? Like, do you feel like that whatever is being advocated in a particular thing, there's much more powerful forces of financial and other interests, not to be conspiratorial, but like that the number of organizations and people that are not doing the work but have the resources to do the high level work is inadequate to the other people advocating for extractive resources or lifting weapons bans or travel bans?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's not conspiratorial to say that there is a power imbalance, right? I think that's just a fact. I will say, as an aside, this is the social change podcast. Like, a lot of what I've been talking about is, folks in the NGO sector, but, obviously there's folks, that are doing really great work in governments around the world, and, there's other opportunities, but also in the private sector, right? There are, private sector efforts, sometimes, not super heavily invested in, but, focusing on corporate social responsibility, or some version of that. But even if you're just, a normal employee at X, Y, or Z company, if you have a social change mindset, that's useful, that's helpful in the ecosystem in which you're operating, right? To help change the narrative, to help move the needle a little bit on some of these issues, to help be a voice of maybe, opposition to some things. I don't want to paint it as like, all corporations are evil and the NGOs are, great, because there's plenty of, NGOs that have challenges, and there's plenty of corporations that are doing good work. But there is, an inherent power balance when it comes to just how much money there is, right, in the private sector versus the NGO sector. And sometimes those two issues do come to a head when it's, land development, or, energy consumption and things like that. But there have been plenty of opportunities where you can, find ways to work together. You can find ways to leverage some of the influence and some of the power and some of the money that some of these, corporations and others have. But sometimes there are challenges. And I was having this conversation with a friend the other day, just talking about, the implications of, where certain money comes from, right? Whether that's, U.S. government money or other money, do we want, there's a big movement right now talking about, anti-colonialism and, trying to get international, actors out of other countries, whether that's, in Sudan or in Israel and Palestine, or whether that's in, DRC, wherever the case may be. But, you have this challenge where you need to get money to support the programs that you're doing. do you then make a decision whether or not you should take money from certain actors versus others? And I don't know that there's always a right or wrong
Mhm.
answer, right? In DRC, I've had, folks that I've known that have been willing to take money from some of the corporations that are somewhat responsible for the raping and pillaging of the country by extracting the resources and extracting the wealth, because they're like, well, like, we need this money to do really good programming. They're willing to give us this money. Why wouldn't we take it? And
Mhm.
there's others who are like, well, why would we partner with the same people that are doing the harm that now we're
Mhm.
trying to rectify? So it's an ongoing challenge, and I think it's I don't know that it's getting any better. In some ways, income inequality, for instance, is getting worse. But yeah, I don't know that I have a direct answer. I think
Yeah.
the cops, the past two cops have been at oil producing countries. We need those oil producing countries to get on board with these issues. If we do want to get away from fossil fuels, and I'm not a climate expert, but obviously that's a big part of the movement. Um, but so does that mean that you don't want them to host, or you do want them to host because then they feel like they have more at stake? But then, yeah, who's in the room? Who can afford to go to these cops? Who can afford to
Yeah.
spend the money on a plane and a hotel and food and board and everything else? And how much damage to the climate are we doing by flying thousands of people
Yeah.
in and out of these countries for these conferences? So
Yeah. And that there is no. I mean, Colombia. I forget what percentage of the GDP comes from extractives. That's a decent amount. It's not Venezuela. We're
right.
not but it's the current government's trying to make moves to at least start moving away from that. But it's also the economy depends on it to a certain percent. If it's I don't know if it's 8 or 10% of our GDP, that produces a lot of jobs. So it's that whole tension. So
There's always,
going back,
right? I mean, just real quick, like, on electric vehicles, the mineral resources that are needed for electric vehicles are being extracted from places like Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo in very horrible ways. I mean, it's almost slave labor, right? And so at some point we need to understand it's not just like fossil fuels bad, electric vehicles good. There's other challenges there, right? And so, and there's also a lot of research that we don't know yet because we haven't had them long enough. What happens to all those chemicals in those
yeah,
batteries in these cars that eventually get crushed or put some, like, what is that going to do to the environment? Like, I don't know that we know the answers to all of those questions yet either. How much money and how much of the fossil fuels does it take to actually then produce the, like, so it's not such a simple equation.
yeah, I mean, we lived without a car for years. We got an electric car maybe 4 years ago because I don't want to ever buy another gas car. In Colombia, it's mostly hydro powered, which obviously hydro dams do destroy the environment. But then there's all these other challenges, as you're saying, the minerals, and then the tires and electric cars because they're much heavier, put off a lot more waste. And then,
Yep.
the research I did, as a non-expert but having done a good amount of research, in the long term, the net positive is better, but electric cars are not the solution to climate change.
Right.
It's really like as much public transportation as possible, walkability, electric, but like small scale transport. Um, so when people come to you and say, "Oh my gosh, Mike, you've had this really amazing career. You're teaching in multiple universities. You work with partners around the world, and whether someone wants to work on atrocity prevention or some other, climate change or education or health access or clean water, what is your advice for trying to ascertain what's the right pathway to enter? Like, I mean, obviously everyone's different, but I have friends who are in government. I have other friends who will never go into government. I have friends who work for oil companies. So, I mean, obviously the range of where you could use these skills is wide. And any advice, whether is it worth trying to go into government and get that experience because whatever you do in the future, it'll make you more employable,
Yeah.
or is it, or you just have to decide based on your own values and like what salary you need and quality of life?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the last part that you mentioned, is a big issue, especially in the NGO nonprofit sector. Obviously, pays less than the private sector or even government. So that's definitely a consideration for folks. But I think for I always tell people it's really important, and I think I've mentioned even earlier in the podcast, like, to figure out both what you like and what you don't like. Like, finding out what you don't want to do is almost as important as finding out what you want to do. And for some folks, if you are really interested, in Eurasia and like that's your area of expertise, like that's like go, like we talked about, like, figure out if that's like you have a specific regional focus that you're really interested in, try to learn the language, try to go, try to spend some time there. get a job, get a fellowship, volunteer on your, like, whatever you can do, get that experience, in country. As far as government goes, yeah, I mean, there's lots of decisions to be made. Obviously, government's huge, and what you can do within, especially U.S. government, it's such a megalith. But do you work on Capitol Hill for try to get a job with a member of Congress that you really respect and support? Do you try to get a job in USAID or the State Department or anything like that? And yes, you could turn that into a great learning experience for a lot of things. I mean, I interned at the Special Envoy's office for Sudan and South Sudan when I was in grad school, and saw a lot from behind the scenes that you don't get to see if you're only from the outside, right? And so being able to get that experience, I think, is useful to better understand, some of the limitations, some of the challenges, some of the ways of working. But you also have to make some decisions, right? Some people may not feel comfortable being, even if you're advocating for good things on one side of the government, while other things are happening that you don't disagree with, and you can't speak out as much. The freedom that you have to some degree within the NGO sector to call out the government and try to make things better, you can try to do from within, but it's a very big machine. So, I think everybody needs to make that decision for themselves. And also it depends on the government, right? Different administrations, a lot can change between one administration to another. Not that I think any of them are perfect, but you could always find a reason to have a challenge, right? During Obama, for me, it was never closing Gitmo, accelerating drone strikes, things like that. Under Trump, there were several different issues, with retreating back in from foreign policy, not wanting to support the UN, et cetera. Biden, obviously, ongoing support for the violence that's being happening in Gaza, and very little attention to Sudan and other crises. So it's really up to the person and try to figure out what it is. The best thing I would say to do is talk to people. Like, go and try to set up informational interviews, go and try to set up meetings, try to learn what do they do, what do they like about their job, what don't they like about their job, what seems interesting to you, and try out what you can.
Mm-hmm. When you go to, I mean, we're both friends with Sasha Lezhnev, but when you go to Eastern DRC or places that are really, or Sudan, or talk to partners in Sudan, places that are just so deeply affected by long-term intractable conflict. I mean, there's a million different reasons. Obviously you can't summarize, but what is it that they would ask partners to do, or others? I mean, obviously everyone around the world wants a decent life, education, clean health, but what are you hearing consistently? And then also, how much, particularly when people are, Colombia still has a huge number of human rights violations and assassinations, disappearances, displacement, both internally, and then we also have lots of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and also we're a transit country. But what is it that you hear from them? And then do you spend much time talking about just security and safety for your partners, or that's something they're doing in themselves? Because a lot of your partners are engaged in challenging contexts, and it's not just, hey, have a meeting and that could lead to some policy change. Like, there's a lot of potential risk in some of those actions.
For sure. Yeah, no, and that's something you have to take into account. Obviously, sometimes you get information from partners in country and you leave their names and organizations off of it because for security reasons. I think I would be hesitant to paint with such a broad brushstroke to say, everybody that lives in a crisis zone in a country that's experiencing X, Y, or Z, this is what they're saying, right? Because I think every context is very different, even within a country. Different places that you're experiencing the situation could be wildly different, right? You could be on the front lines of the crisis. You could be, getting secondary or tertiary impacts of the crisis, et cetera. What I will say that I do find to be the case is that more often than not, the average person that you talk to just wants to live a quote unquote normal life, right? And this is a thing that I think is so interesting. People talk about refugees, fleeing their countries and going to other places, and it's such a challenge. Almost every single refugee that you would talk to, if they had their choice, would be very happy to stay in their home country, right? If there was not conflict, if there wasn't insecurity, if there were opportunities, if there were, safety and security for their family and their children, et cetera. Many of these people are forced into these situations by external forces. And that's an ongoing challenge, is that, so much of the programming, so much of the thinking, so much of the policy is short term, not long term. And so, you have a situation where all of a sudden, a conflict breaks out. You have, a million plus, people that are fleeing the crisis, either as, internally displaced people or crossing a border as a refugee. And, they say now the average displacement is like 20 plus years, right? Well, if the only thinking that we have is short term and we're providing some food aid and we're doing whatever we can, if those people are going to be there for 20 years, we need to be thinking about that so they're not losing an entire generation of children, not getting education, being malnourished, having psychosocial challenges that are never dealt with, all this stuff. Because then you're creating a situation where maybe the conflict ends in that 20-year span. Those people don't have any resources, don't have any education, don't have any opportunities, and they've never dealt with some of the challenges that they were, facing in the beginning. And so they're not being set up in a way that you're like, okay, the conflict end, go home. Like that's not it's not realistic. So I think that's a serious issue. And then as far as the security concerns too, there's two sides to it, right? On the one side, there are certain people who are very willing to risk their lives and say what they're going to say and be front and center, record themselves, etc. And unfortunately, those people tend to be the ones that end up, as you said, disappearing, being arrested, maybe needing to be evacuated from the country or whatever the case may be. And I've always taken it as a way to you have to own your own like security concerns. You have to own your own safety, and decide, do I want to do this? Like I might try to talk somebody out of something or like warn them or be concerned, but like if somebody wants to take that on for themselves, it's not for me to tell them no. And vice versa. It's not for me or for anybody else that's sitting comfortable in the United States or wherever to put somebody at risk by sharing their identity, sharing their location, sharing anything like that, unless they explicitly say that that's what they want to do. So there needs to be that really close relationship and ensuring that kind of primum non nocere, first do no harm as best as you can.
So we'll wrap up just two more questions. So the first one, when you think about atrocities prevention in general, where do you go, whether it's conferences or books or podcasts or, convenings, like where do you go to kind of understand what's working well and, also express frustrations about the insanity of so much of this? So is there any particular, resources that you'd recommend for people who are either working in this or aspiring to, like, go to this conference, this is the best podcast, or there's 5 books, or, any key resources that you find are not just repeating the same thing over and over again?
Yeah. Sometimes the best is like just chatting with people who get it. I mean, when I was in London, I was very fortunate to have like a 4-hour chat with a friend, who's also in the space and just kind of talking about all the things. Because I think atrocity prevention is a, somewhat unique niche, field. I think there are some really good podcasts. I think, they don't, not all of them explicitly focus on AP. I think, Expert Voices from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect specifically focuses on expert voices in atrocity prevention. UN Dispatches, I think, is a really good podcast to try to get a sense of like, what's happening within the UN system, and how that sometimes does overlap with, AP or peace building or, conflict prevention. There are obviously conferences on the more academic side, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, things like that. But, sadly, and this is, I was just talking about this with a colleague earlier this week as well, a lot of the funding that existed for atrocity prevention in the past has dried up. And despite the fact that, as you said earlier, there's more atrocities today than there were before, there's less and less funding for this work specifically. And so I used to be involved in these conferences, both as a younger person and then somebody who was running them, conferences for people to come to DC, learn about atrocity prevention, learn about these things, go to the Hill, get involved. And those things don't really exist anymore, which is really unfortunate, especially for younger people, college students and otherwise, who are seeing these things now viscerally on social media, wanting to channel that energy, wanting to do something, and not having a professionalized outlet to help them do that.
And then the actually last 2 questions: any book, podcast, show, movie that doesn't have anything to do with atrocity prevention, but it's just occupying your brain in a interesting way that you might say it could be about atrocity prevention, but it could just be about anything that just is occupying, creating some thought generation about interesting ideas that you might want to share with others.
That's a really good question. I feel like all of the things that I read tend to be in the human rights atrocity prevention space. So like, books and articles and things like that. I don't really listen to any podcasts that are for pleasure either. My go-to things, I play video games, so like that's an outlet for me. And I love movies and TV. Like one of the shows that I'm watching, Shrinking, I think is
Yes.
fantastic. I think I love Jason Segel. I love Brett
Mhm.
Goldberg. Like I think and Harrison Ford, obviously. I think it's a great show just to kind of like tune off your brain, have some comedy, like enjoy that, and you don't need to think too hard about it. But yeah.
Okay. And then the last question for people who want to follow your work, is LinkedIn the best channel? Do you have a website or just anywhere else you suggest people
Yeah, I'm
to
actually
engage with?
trying to build. I built a website forever ago and I have not updated it, so I'm trying to rebuild that. But I'm at Mike the Idealist pretty much everywhere on social media.
Okay.
So you can follow me there, and then also on LinkedIn. I'm sure you could link to my profile when you
Okay.
post
Yeah,
it.
we'll share in the show notes. And so you're
Perfect.
still an idealist. If you're going by Mike the idealist, you're not Mike the jaded idealist or Mike the half an
Yeah, I
idealist.
consider myself a pragmatic idealist. I
Okay.
believe, we can still change the world. I have my, it always seems impossible until it's done from Nelson Mandela. Like I
Uh-huh.
do truly believe that we can get there. And I think sometimes we need to take some smaller steps to do that. But I mean, if I ever lose that, then I don't know what I'll do. I mean, things are so dark right now that if I don't
Mhm.
hold on to that little bit of hope, then, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so please follow Mike the Idealist. Again, this will all be in the show notes. Follow him on LinkedIn. And just to make a plug for a couple of resources. So one, the Scoville Fellowship, which is for DC. You got to be in the US. I don't think you have to be US citizen. Applications are due January 6th. But it's a 9-month paid fellowship, not specific in atrocity prevention, more peace building, but it's a great opportunity for people in the US who want to get more DC experience. And there's the Rotary Peace Fellowship. And I would say, one of the there's lots of great organizations doing incredible work. International Crisis Group, it's not specifically atrocity prevention, but
Yep.
doing really high quality. Like I think it's one of the best examples of like using information to create actionable recommendations for a wide range of actors, both in country, regionally, and globally. And they often are hiring, for very senior positions or just like sometimes communication. But the infrastructure is better, but I agree the results and the funding is not. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, and I'll just say, because since you're plugging, I'm currently working with the Sudanese American Physicians Association, which is doing tremendous work, in Sudan. And so if you want to give them a look and a follow, that'd be amazing. And just a very quick thing I'll just say to you, since you mentioned International Crisis Group, it's another good thing to think about what kind of organization, right? Like ICG does amazing work. They're putting out reports, they're doing advocacy. They don't have programs, right? They're not a
Yep.
programmatic implementation organization. And so some organizations, some people may want to be an implementer or may want to work with an organization that has that on the ground programmatic side. And some
Mhm.
are very happy to do the desk research, the in-person research, and just, bang out reports. So, got to figure out what you want to do.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, energy, and idealism. I should have asked your username at the beginning. And thank you for people watching. And again, this podcast will be live in about a week and a half. So,
Perfect.
as we started off, please follow Mike on LinkedIn. All the resources we've talked about will be in the show notes. Please consider sharing